spending for the rest of this budget year. Returning live now to the Senate. Earlier today, the Senate approved a repeal of a tax provision in the health care law for small business. Right now, Senator Tom Coburn speaking on the Senate floor.
What it means is we put into law a limitation on ourselves on the amount of money we can borrow. Now, President Bush, I believe my facts are correct, asked for the debt limit to be extended 7 times. This will be the second under President Obama's leadership, and it's been extended multitudes of times prior to that. And as a physician, I'm querying myself to ask the question, why do we put a limit on our debt when every time it comes up, we just raise the limit again? And the answer to that question is the limit doesn't mean anything because we continue to disregard the difficulty we're in. If a debt limit really meant something, that means we would make changes and take actions to limit the amount of money we're spending so we would not break the debt limit or have to raise the debt limit. So as a physician, when I think about the debt limit's a symptom simply of another problem. And that other problem is we in Congress, this Congress, the Congress before this, and the 10, 20 Congresses before that, have not taken seriously the idea that this country has to live within its means. And in fact, we are not living within our means. We weren't living within our means before the housing crisis of 2008. We weren't living within our means except at one short period of time when we had a true net surplus of about $36 billion thanks to the tech bubble and the fact that in 1995, the 104th Congress did a rescission package that of significant amount, under $30 billion, but the accumulated benefit of that allowed us to run those surpluses. So the question before our country today is the Congress just going to pass another debt limit? Are we just going to raise the debt limit again and not do what every other family, every other business, and every other organization in this country has to do, and in fact the rest of the world? And that is, they don't have the liberty of spending money they don't have on things they don't absolutely need. And I believe the question the American people ought to be asking of Congress and this President is, how dare you even consider raising the debt limit till you've done a thorough job of finding out whether the programs, the multitudes, hundreds of thousands of programs that we have, actually function efficiently, actually do their intended purpose, and in fact are a legitimate role for the federal government to be doing in the first place. We're always going to have the bipartisan or the partisan debate on whether taxes aren't high enough or spending isn't low enough. But all of those belie the real problem is this country can't continue to live beyond its means. And in point of fact that this Congress doesn't want to do that, we have a small business bill on the floor for which we're all tied up in knots because we really don't want to make votes that actually will cut $20 billion worth of spending this year. We don't want to have those votes, so we've had all these shenanigans to try to keep amendments that actually do something from coming to the floor. And I think the American people ought to look at us and say, what is going on? Do you not get it? Do you not understand that the country as a whole is now experiencing what a large number of our families did over the last 2 years, is that the amount coming in is less than the amount going out, and adjustments in how we spend and what we spend have to be made. We've got an ethanol amendment that I understand is controversial, and the fact is it'll be voted on after the cloture's filed on this bill. But it's an amendment that will save a true $4.9 billion this year alone, and the money for that tax credit that goes to the international and national oil companies in this country to blend ethanol with fuel They've sent a letter and said they don't want the money. So how do you justify voting to send money, $4.9 billion, to ExxonMobil and Chevron and ConocoPhillips and all the rest of the big ones that are going to show tremendous profits with oil prices where they are today? When they say they don't want it, how do you justify continuing to send that money to them? How do you vote against not sending that money back to the Treasury, not borrowing that money from the Chinese to pay the large oil companies to blend ethanol? It's not a justification. And so the reason we're not having a vote is because they know it will pass. That amendment will pass. That's why we're not having a vote. America ought to look at the Senate and say, you're not having a vote on something that will save America almost $5 billion this year, before the end of this year, that the people who are getting that money don't want and have written to the Congress and said we don't want the money, and yet we're not going to be allowed to take that amendment up in regular order, and we're not going to have a vote on it because a small special interest group doesn't want that to happen. You talk about dysfunctional. Talk about having our heads in the sand. Talk about not addressing the real problem of the debt limit when we can't even do anything that simple of saving the American people $5 billion on one amendment that will save that money just like that, and we won't do it. Some real change has to happen, and not enough change has happened yet. The Government Accountability Office, Government Accounting Office, issued a report a month ago outlining massive duplication throughout our government, the first third of it, massive amounts of duplication. The question on the other side is, are these legitimate roles for the federal government? We're not even going to debate that. The fact is they showed massive amounts of duplication in large areas across the government in things that we have multiple programs to do the exact same thing. And so we have an amendment that will save $5 billion this year. If we'll just vote an amendment and say, let's cut $5 billion out of at least $50 to $100 billion that we know is there, and let's do it this year, and let's have the administration mandate that they have to do it. That's another $5 billion. Well, in two amendments, we will have covered everything we will have cut with the CRs. And they're common sense. They match what the American people want us to do. If we had true world bankers, they'd be telling us to do it as well. And yet we haven't been able to achieve to get a vote on that. Then we have the fact that we have unemployed millionaires to the tune of taking, I believe, the number is $20 million in unemployment checks. People earning $1 million a year taking $20 million from the taxpayers of this country for unemployment. We should not let that go on 1 second longer. Unemployment is for people who desperately need it. It's not for those that don't. What we've also found is a tremendous cost as we research the data on the unemployment for millionaires, that we're spending almost $5 billion a year to manage the unemployment program in this country at the federal level when 85 to 90% of the work's done at the state level. We didn't even offer that amendment to downsize that. So the question I have for my colleagues is, let's go back to the debt extension, the statutory debt limit. You know, I'm of a mind, and I think the average American, regardless of what the consequences are and all the fear-mongering that we hear about, oh, you have to do this, you have to do this, I don't think we should do it until we've followed some of the common sense prescriptions that the average family does in this country before we extend a debt limit. And my knowledge of the functioning of this town says it's doubtful we'll ever do that. So I would call on my colleagues to start thinking about what the real disease is in Washington. And the real disease is we don't have the courage to make the very hard choices that are in front of our country today and then live with the results of that in terms of how it's going to impact our political careers. Everybody's got a program they want to protect. Well, the message for America today is every program is going to get hit. The Defense Department's going to get hit. Every program is going to get hit. My taxes are going to go up. Sorry, they're going to go up. This country cannot get out of this mess with the behavior that we're exhibiting in this body. And if we fail to do what is necessary for our country at this critical time in our juncture, history will deem us absolutely incompetent. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my colleague has talked about one disease in Washington, but I want to talk about another disease that seems to be running rampant over in the House Republican caucus, and that is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. And the reason I say that is that they say one thing and they mean another. They say one thing and they deceive the American public. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't comment on the behavior or the tribal mores of the House Republican caucus, but they've had a field day on TV, kind of ridiculing the Senate, kind of ridiculing the Democratic Senate, essentially doing a lot of name-calling. Now, I'm not doing name-calling. I'm going to do fact-describing. The reason I call it hypocrisy is this. What they say they want to do, which is reduce government spending, they don't. They only do it on particular groups of people. And the other is something called the consequences of the shutdown. Let me just say this. They want to cut spending, but they're unwilling to cut their own pay. Sure, I'm for a government that's more frugal. I'm for cuts, but I'm not for their cuts. What they propose is reckless and radical. And when they don't get their own way, they say, cut it or shut it. However, I say take this position. If there is a government shutdown, I don't think that members of Congress should be paid. If there is a government shutdown and we tell dedicated federal employees that they're not going to get paid, that they're non-essential, well, the fact that we couldn't stop a shutdown shows we're non-essential, and I believe if there is a shutdown, members of Congress should not get paid. I not only want to express that as a sentiment, I did that backing Senator Barbara Boxer's bill, which passed the Senate, that said if there is a shutdown, members of Congress don't get paid. Now, what did the House Republicans do? They passed a bill that I won't go into the details, but on this relevant section, they said, oh, members of Congress and the president doesn't get paid. But guess what? They allow for retroactive payment. Now, the Senate bill doesn't do that. So they would be the only ones in shutdown that can come back and pick up that little paycheck that they have stuck in a corner. You talk about hypocrisy? That's called bait and switch. It ought to be under some kind of consumer protection law. Even the title of their bill is wrong. Their bill says the Government Shutdown Prevention Act. Well, their bill doesn't stop a shutdown. It doesn't even help with a sit-down. What is a sit-down? Where we would come to the table and as grown-up Americans, we would try to arrive at how to pass a continuing resolution to fund the government that recognizes not only debt, but that there are certain aspects of the government program we need to be able to fund. My constituents were outraged when Wall Street executives got hundreds of millions of dollars of bonuses. Well, they should be outraged when, as members of Congress, we're going to get paid when they don't. Here's what I don't get. In my home state I'm the home of the National Institutes of Health. Right now, I have thousands of people working as a team to find the cure for Alzheimer's, for AIDS, for autism, for cancer. You know, we race for the cure, and we should, but oh no, we're going to tell those researchers that they're non-essential. Right now, I represent, now and in the future, I represent the headquarters for the Social Security Administration. Right now, there are thousands of federal employees processing the claims of Social Security, making sure someone who's disabled qualifies their benefit. They're going to be told they're non-essential. Well, let me tell you this, Mr. President. On any given day, if somebody in whatever town they live goes to their Social Security office and find it shuttered because they cannot apply for a benefit that they believe they're eligible for, I think they would rather shut us down than Social Security offices be shut down. And if you ask anybody in the United States of America, who do you think's more essential? Members of Congress or the researchers working on a cure for cancer? Or for those people working to defend our borders? I could give example after example. You know where they are. So it's very clear that people know they depend on the functioning of a federal government by a civil service that's honest, that has integrity, and counts on us to make sure we keep government doors open. So that's one thing while we negotiate the numbers. Numbers do matter. I'm ready to come to the table. I believe all Democrats are ready to come to the table. But we will not come to the table to engage in meaningless discussions and pursuing a way that is reckless. I will discuss about the recklessness more. But what I want everybody to understand, Democrats and the Senate passed a bill that said if there is a shutdown, we don't get paid, no way, no day, and no back pay. So no way, no back pay. The House, in the meantime, does the sham scam that says, oh, yeah, we'll pretend that we're not getting paid, but we're going to pick up a back payment. You know, I just don't get these guys. They want to take away Medicare and turn it into a voucher program, but they're sure happy picking up government health care. They love getting government federally subsidized health care. They want to take away other people's pensions, but they sure like getting their federal employee pension. So I'm going to put an end to the hypocrisy, and I'm going to put an end to this CR dangling. I think we need to come to the table. I think we need to pass a responsible budget that recognizes that we are in a frugal era. And we need to make sure, though, the American people know when that we are on their side. And at the same time, the American people need to know that we're willing, many of us, are to say a shutdown, if a shutdown comes and federal employees get no pay, if contractors get no pay, we get no pay and no back pay. Mr. President, I'll have more to say to this as this week unfolds. But before I sit down, I would say, please, let's sit down rather than have a shutdown. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
We heard Senators Coburn and Mikulski talking about spending for the rest of this budget year. President Obama made a surprise appearance in the White House briefing room a short time ago, talking about federal spending for fiscal 2011, saying that he believes a budget deal is still possible that will avert a government shutdown this weekend. Funding for the federal government expires on Friday. During that, we heard the President talk about House Speaker Boehner. The President met with Speaker Boehner, also Majority Leader Harry Reid. And after that meeting, John Boehner said that House Republicans will not be put in a box of accepting options that they refuse to endorse. If they can't reach an agreement, Speaker Boehner says that House Republicans want another stopgap bill that would keep the government running for one more week and slash another $12 billion in spending. Right now, Majority Leader Harry Reid is at what's called the Ohio clock inside the Capitol after the weekly party lunches. We're going to watch him live now.
4 o'clock, I'll do that. Hour and 20 minutes from now, I look forward. I hope there's something done at that meeting. I'm going to do everything that I can do. But I hope the Republicans do what the country needs, not what they believe the Tea Party wants. I'm not real optimistic. No, I'm not. I think that the Tea Party is driving what goes on in the House of Representatives. And we cannot do what they want done. I repeat, $73 billion. We have been willing to do what is fair and ratchet down very, very hard on programs dealing with domestic discretionary spending. We can't go anymore. So the extra money in there, we can get them their number. It's not a question of number. It's ideological with them. And I would also say this. I know that my Republican counterpart came here and talked about this great bill that they, in the middle of the night, early this morning, 12:30, put to the Rules Committee. Now, listen to this one. They took all the domestic discretionary that we agreed to do, if in fact it were part of an overall deal. But they, in my opinion, not in good faith, took those dollars, stuck them in to this short-term CR they have for a one-week extension. And then they're trying to fund the Defense Department for the rest of the year when everybody else is funded for 1 week. And then, if that's not good enough, they stick an abortion rider on this. I mean, it seems that every step we take, it's something just to poke us in the eye. They're not trying to arrive at the finish line. It appears that they're going to do everything they can to satisfy the Tea Party.
Senator Reid, will Senate Democrats put forth your own alternative plan and vote on it on the floor?
The answer is, you know, there are things that we can do, and we're considering that.
Is that 1 week CR then down on arrival? I mean, if it gets here?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
It's not amendable?
Pardon me?
It's not amendable. In other words, you just would not take it.
Well, it's according when we get it. You know, I'll be happy to get it over here to see if we feel that it would give us some time to amend it. I don't know when they're going to send it to us. They could do it as early as tomorrow. They could probably, probably. I guess there would be a way they could do it tomorrow.
Any time on the EPA amendment for greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I think we have that almost worked out. I think we're very, very close. I have been gone for a few hours, but I think that the floor staff was directed to do a consent agreement to allow us to move forward on this bill.
Senator Reid, why are you meeting without the White House intervention? And is there a reason for
I've been invited to a meeting. We haven't established much at these scrums I have every week, but the one thing we have established, I'm not going to negotiate here what we're going to do ultimately. Pardon me?
It's in your office, Senator.
It's not in my office. I don't think so.
What's the President's role at this point, Senator Reid? What can he do?
No, it's not in my office. It's a place, but it's not in my office. It's not in the Senate side of the Capitol.
What's the President's role at this point? What is he? He's coming into the
Well, the President spent an hour and 20 minutes with us this morning. He clearly thinks that it would be better that we reached an agreement, but he agrees with me. There's only so much that we can do. We have bent over backwards to try to be fair and reasonable. But when you have one party that can't be fair and reasonable, it makes it a real hard push. And he was, I think, very, very engaged this morning. And he had a press event afterwards that most of you watched. I didn't, but it's my understanding that he said at that event that there's going to be a meeting this afternoon with the Speaker and with me, and if there's no progress made, he's going to have us back to the White House. That's what I heard he said. Thank you, everybody.
So negotiations continue on federal spending for the rest of this budget year through September 30th. House Speaker John Boehner has proposed an agreement that would keep the government running for one more week and slash another $12 billion in spending. President Obama said he'll only accept another short-term funding extension of 2 or 3 days in order to get a longer-term deal through Congress, but he ruled out a longer extension to allow negotiations to continue. Earlier today in the Senate, members cleared a bill that would repeal a provision in the health care law that requires small businesses to file a 1099 form through the IRS for payments of more than $600 that they make to any vendor during the tax year beginning in 2012.
Majority Leader.
I ask consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I've had a number of discussions over the last few days with my new friend from Kentucky, this junior senator from Kentucky, Senator Paul, and he feels very strongly about an issue, and he should have a right to talk about that. So I would ask unanimous consent to be 10 minutes for Senator Paul to speak prior to my being recognized, to have the bill called up, that is the Small Business Jobs Bill, and that the time that Senator Paul be recognized be as of morning business.
Without objection, so ordered.
And during that morning business time, it would be for debate only by Senator Paul.
Without objection, so ordered. Senator from Kentucky.
President.
Senator from Kentucky is recognized.
I thank very much the Majority Leader for allowing this important debate to occur. Candidate Barack Obama said during his campaign that no president should unilaterally initiate military conflict without congressional authority. I agree with that statement. It's a very important constitutional principle and something that I think deserves debate. I think the most important thing we do as representatives is voting on whether or not to go to war. If Congress doesn't vote to go to war or doesn't vote on the notion of going to war, we would have an unlimited presidency, and this is a very dangerous notion. I would take this position no matter what the party affiliation were of the president, because I believe very strongly in the constitutional checks and balances. We will vote today on the president's own words, verbatim. The president said during the election, the president does not have the power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation. Clearly, the circumstances in Libya do not rise to this, and I think this vote is incredibly important. Madison wrote that the Constitution supposes what history demonstrates, that the executive is the branch most interested in war and most prone to it. Therefore, the Constitution has, with studied care,
given that power to the legislature. Don't tread on me was a motto and a rallying cry for our founding fathers. The new motto of Congress appears to be, tread on me, please tread on me. The Congress has become not just a rubber stamp for an unlimited presidency, but worse, Congress has become a doormat to be stepped upon, to be ignored, and basically to be treated as irrelevant. Now, some would say, well, we had no time. We had to go to war. There was no time for debate. When we were attacked in World War II on December 7th, Pearl Harbor, within 24 hours, this body came together and voted to declare war on Japan. There is no excuse for the Senate not to vote on going to war before we go to war. The President had time to go to the United Nations, have a discussion and a vote. The President had time to go to the Arab League, have a discussion and a vote. The President had the time to go to NATO, but the President had no time to come to the People's House, to the Congress, and ask, as the Constitution dictates, for the approval of the American people and for the approval of Congress. Now, why is this important? It's important because when our nation was founded, we were founded as a constitutional republic. We placed limitations not only on the President, but on the Congress. We are supposed to obey the Constitution. These are important principles, and we have gone beyond that. We have gotten to the point where my question is, are we even obeying the Constitution in this body? This is a sad day. This is a sad day for America. The thing is we need to have checks and balances. Do we want an unlimited presidency, a presidency that could take us to war anywhere, anytime, without the approval of Congress? Now, some have said, well, we're going to have a vote sometime in the next couple weeks. When we get around to it, we may have a debate about Libya. Had the President showed true leadership, the President would have, when he called the United Nations, when he called the Arab League, when he called NATO, the President would have called the leadership of the Senate and the leadership of the House, and we would have been here within 24 hours having what should be the most momentous debate that this body ever has on sending our young, brave men and women to war. We are currently engaged in 2 wars, and we are now going to be engaged in a 3rd war. Now, the interesting thing is, when we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, we had votes in this body. President Bush came to Congress, and there were votes. The War Powers Act, some on the other side say, well, this is no big deal. The President can do whatever he wants as long as he notifies Congress within a certain period of time. This is not a correct interpretation of the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act does say he needs to notify Congress, but the War Powers Act also says that the President must meet 3 hurdles before taking our troops into harm's way. Number 1, there should be a declaration of war, or there should be an authorization of force from this body, or there should be imminent danger to the nation. None of these 3 things were adhered to. The law was not adhered to. Well, some will say, well, the War Powers Act, no president recognizes it. Well, the War Powers Act is the law of the land, and the President needs to respect not only the statutory law of the land, but the Constitution. I don't think these are trivial questions, but I am bemused. I am confused. I do not understand why your representatives are not down here debating such a momentous thing as going to war. I can think of no vote and no debate more important than sending our young men and women to war. It should be done reluctantly. We should go to war only when threatened as a nation, and when engaged in 2 wars, we should debate the prudence of being involved in a 3rd war. These are not trivial questions, and I am amazed that this body does not take the time to debate whether we should be in Libya. Now, some have said, well, we'll debate it next week. The problem is the debate should occur before we go to war. At this point, we will have a vote. We will have a vote on the President's own words. And I will yield for a minute or two for a question, if that's okay. For a question? Yes. I will yield for a question from the senator from Utah.
Senator from Utah is recognized.
What we have with this situation with Libya presents us with a fundamental question, one that we have wrestled with for a couple of centuries as a nation. The founding era was a time that was fraught with wars. It was a time when we learned that executives sometimes abuse their power. Sometimes they'll take us into wars in faraway nations without the support of the people, knowing full well that it's the sons and daughters of the people on the ground who are asked to make the ultimate sacrifice for those battles. We channeled the war power in the Constitution so as to make sure that these debates would always come to the forefront, that they would always be brought up by the elected representatives of the people in Congress. And for that reason, although we give power to the President to be the Commander-in-Chief in Article 2 of the Constitution, in Article 1 of the Constitution, we reserve that power, the power to declare war, to Congress. This is how we guarantee that the people's voice will be heard and that people's sons and their daughters won't be sent off to war without some public debate and discussion by those who have been duly elected by the people and stand accountable to the people. We have over time clarified the intent of this, and we've made clear that there are certain steps that have to be taken. We've also made clear that although there is, to be sure, a certain unknown continuum, a continuum that can be hard to define in every circumstance, between, on the one hand, the President's plenary authority as Commander-in-Chief on the one hand, and on the other hand, Congress's power to declare war on the other. There does come a point at which we can recognize that we're at war and that some authorization is required by Congress. This very body, Congress, has, through the War Powers Resolution, attempted to distill some of these principles. And in Section 1541 of the War Powers Act, it's found at the 50 United States Code, Section 1541, we are told that there are circumstances, 3 circumstances, to be precise.
Senator's time has expired. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, first of all, I want to express my appreciation to the senator from Kentucky. He is a gentleman. I know how sincere he feels about this issue, and I admire him for feeling sincerely about issues as he does on a number of things. And it's been good for me to get to know him better during these last 4 or 5 days. I would ask now, Mr. President, for the clerk to report the pending business.
Clerk will report the pending business.
Counter number 17, S-493, a bill to reauthorize and improve the SBIR and STTR programs and for other purposes.
Mr. President, it's my understanding that the Paul amendment is a pending business. Is that right?
The motion to commit by Senator Paul is pending.
I would move to table that. Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There's to be. Yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt. Yes, sir. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Ensign, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inoue, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Franken, Kyle, McCain, McConnell, Reed of Nevada, Schumer, and Webb. Mr. Paul voted in the negative. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Collins.
No.
Ms. Collins, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mr. Ensign. Mr. Ensign, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Snow, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Brown of Ohio, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Dement. Mr. Dement, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Akaka. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, aye. Mr. Ensign, no. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye.
Are there any senators who wish to change, to vote or to change his or her vote? There being none, the ayes are 90, the nays are 10. The motion to the table, the motion to commit is agreed to.